Today we're going to talk about AJAX, or asynchronous JavaScript with XML and JSON. It stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and it's a group of technologies coming together to help solve the problem. And so this allows us to import data in and out of our web pages without loading a new page, which is what had to happen in the early days of the internet. Up until the 2000s, you had to load a new page every time you wanted to send or receive data. And so that made things more like a static web page. Now we have what we would call a web app or a web application that makes it where we can send data at any time without having to load that page. So Ajax was really popular and helpful, and it's somewhat of a buzzword, or was for a while, but it's really something that we do all the time. It is used every page that you see just about. So anytime you see form validations, anytime you see a search engine or predictive text where it adds in and puts information in there, what's happening is the browser is sending data or request to the server is responding with data and filling in that information. And so it makes our life a little bit easier, it makes it better for the user. You also see this a lot in e-commerce, specifically around being able to add things to your cart without leaving the page. And a lot of data visualizations and dashboards and things are all run by Ajax, excuse me. So let's go back a little bit and look at 2005. So in 2005, this is where the term comes from, AJAX. Note that it originally was capital A lowercase JAX because James Garnett, who wrote the article about it, he said it was a term and not an acronym. And so he was very specific about that, and it is a nice, helpful thing that made people just use that term AJAX now, but really it's just loading in dynamic data. It used to only be XML. We are going to use JSON and XML, but let's start with XML. We're going to learn how to do that with XML first because we could be seeing data that way. And then we'll also learn how to do this in JSON. So let's start with XML. XML means it is an extensible markup language. It is structured. It is easy to transport. What we mean by that is to move it, save it, and distribute it. In most cases, it's human readable. It is also well formed, which means it has an opening and a closing. It's easy for a machine to understand when to open and close or when a particular node ends. The tags are intuitive and can be named anything and are custom to what the developer defines. It is fairly easy to program once you know the syntax. It's pretty straightforward. So there's a lot of things you can do with XML that we'll probably never get into in this class. When I was in computer science school, I had a whole class just on XML. We had a textbook this thick of all the things you could do with it, with data security and encryption. And if we were building a different type of app that needed more security, we might consider using XML as a data transport because we could encrypt it and do some other things. So here's an example of XML. Note that the top node always opens with question mark XML. Now, as I've said in the past, question mark means jQuery. Not in this case. This is a different language, and question mark is just our way of defining that this is an XML document. So it goes question mark XML and then names the version. Anything version 1 or higher is fine. Every piece of XML starts with a parent node. So in this case, the parent node is people. And inside of people, there are multiple people, and each node of that is called a person. So we always have to have a parent node. Then we have a person, and this node has what we call as an attribute, which is the highlighted name equals quote. So that is an attribute of the node person. This one has two attributes. It has an image attribute and a name attribute. Okay? So note that a node can, but does not have to, have an attribute. The XML also now has a child node called description, and description is a child of person, and so every person has a description. So this is a basic XML document. Note how every node opens and every node closes, like we might see in HTML. Now let's look at JSON, or JSON if you sometimes hear it. stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is also a structured data format, but it doesn't have that closing tag. And so that makes it a little bit lighter. It's a little bit faster. It's easy to save and load just like XML. It is also human readable, but some would argue that it's not as much as XML because of the syntax that it uses. But I feel that if you take it and use it in JSONP, which really means JSON for people, where it has nice spacing, it is human readable. But it can be minimized just like any JavaScript can. As I said, it doesn't have any closing tags. It is written like JavaScript, so once you know the syntax of JavaScript, you can easily write JSON. And the tags can also be custom made specific to what you're doing, and it can be intuitive to the data that they're displaying and can be made by whatever the developer chooses. It is fairly easy to program, especially if you're programming in JavaScript, but it is not as extensible as XML. It is fast and efficient, but it doesn't have all of the encryption and other things that you could do with XML. So let's look at a JSON file. So note that it opens with a bracket, and then we have the curly bracket to define the first node. And this is just like we see in regular JavaScript, where you have a node, and if you have a node to follow it, there's a comma at the end of each single node that is then repeated. So our first node doesn't really have a name, but essentially it's a class. And it has a PK, which stands for primary key, which we'll see in other languages and things. And then we have a subnode called fields. And then in this case, we have multiple fields under it. Each field is defined by quote, the name that you want it to be, colon, and then the data that comes after it. And then note the trailing comma, but not on the last node. So this is, you can choose whichever one you like. A lot of times you're seeing a lot more move towards JSON data, but you could be working with government data that's coming in XML. There's lots of different ways that we see this. And so we're going to learn both of them in this class. And I think it's important that we learn both. And then you can decide which one you want to use for specific projects. People like to debate this. Your kind of pure web programmers might argue that JSON is better. This is kind of like the Mac or PC, the Canon versus Nikon. Which one is better? They both have value. For the large data sets, XML tends to be larger in file size because there's more bytes, there's more text because you have the closing tags. If you're doing data that's just going to be populating a web page very quickly and it's needed for that kind of quick transport, JSON is perfect for that. But you may be making queries to a large database and you want to encrypt that and send that across, then XML might be the way to go. So it doesn't really matter. They both have their purpose and we'll learn both. So I said it's multiple technologies coming together. So we have XML or JSON and we have JavaScript, and JavaScript makes the request. So what happens is the browser using JavaScript calls the data and makes a request to receive an XML or JSON feed. The data is displayed instantly as JSON or as the JavaScript writes the code. So as it goes down that script, if there is data there, it can put that in as fast as you can write any variable. And so it looks like it was real time giving you updated information. So for example, you could say, hello, Steven, because you know my name from my user data. And so you're able to give that application concept rather than just a static web page. So here is a standard JavaScript function that would do an XML HTTP request. Now, this is a lot of code. There's a lot going on. And it's running this function and gets a status and has error handling. And it's kind of a lot of work to get just some data. But with jQuery has done the hard work for us and taken basically all this code that's at the top there and put it into an AJAX function in jQuery. So whenever you see $.AJAX, it's taking care of this HTTP XML request and packing that into a much smaller amount of code that's easier for us to work with. So jQuery really helps us out, and there's documentation on the AJAX website. I'm sorry, there's a documentation on the jQuery website on how to do an AJAX call. Just go look at the AJAX part of jQuery. So one thing we need to deal with first is modern browsers do not allow for the loading of an external file with a different protocol. So we're using HTTP or HTTPS protocol. And if you're previewing an HTML file on your local machine, it uses the file protocol. So it displays an HTML file, but there's actually no ability to do a request. And so Chrome and Firefox and all these others block those types of requests. So let me show you what happens. So here I have a fully complete, ready to go file that loads in external XML and populates it. This is going to be your final project or your final assignment for today. And so it's ready to go. This is the completed version, but you don't see anything. And you get this error that says access to the XML HTTP request is not available, essentially. And so it's not trusted. It doesn't allow you to do it. So what we need to do is to run a simple server. And Python has the simple server built in, but basically we need to turn our computer into a web server. And instead of going to file : we'll go to http : into that IP address. So what I want you to do is open your terminal, and then you're going to cd to your directory. And to show you a quick little trick, you can type cd space and then get the folder that you want from the Finder and copy it over and hit enter. And now it just cd'd to that particular path. So here I've got all those files. And if I type pwd, I can see exactly where I am. So I'm in my folder that I'm working on. And that's important because now we're going to run our simple server. So if you have Python 2.7, which is likely, you're going to run the top command here. So Python simple HTTP server, and then space 8000. So we're going to put it on the 8000 port, and we hit enter. And I misspelled it. So let's try again. Python -m is what I forgot. So -m, Python -m, simple HTTP server 8000. Sorry about that. And now it's running. So instead of previewing here, if I go to localhost : 8000, now you're seeing a directory listing of all the files in there. If there was an index.html file, it would have immediately just gone ahead and displayed that. But I wanted you to see what this looks like. And so the file that I've been working on is index_teach because I'm trying to teach you with it. And then now if I click that and look at my source, there's no errors, but that's the wrong one. I need to go to the complete one. And then now if I go to complete, it is loading it and I'm not getting any errors. Okay, these are different errors, but you'll see. So now we have a server running, and we are going to open our HTML, give it an index file, make it index.html. And then you'll see that there is nothing in the body other than the script. So there's no divs, it's only script tags, links to a CSS file, and so it's a very basic HTML file. It links to main.js, which is where we're going to put our JavaScript code. And so the first thing we want to do is build this in a document ready, like we've done for all of our other things. So we're going to do a document ready function. And inside that function, we're going to put in an AJAX call. Now, this is an AJAX function that comes from jQuery. So if you go to the jQuery site and search for AJAX, you'll find this particular code here. So let me see what my error is. Got one too many. There we go. And let's make sure that all of our tabbing makes sense. Okay. So now I have an AJAX call inside my document ready function. And now let's walk through what this is doing. jQuery use the AJAX function and pass these parameters to that function. So the first thing it does is it does a GET request. So what type? Is it a GET or a POST? So we're going to use a POST. I mean, not a POST. We're going to use a GET request. It asks for the URL. The URL can be to a single static file like this, or it could be to something on a server. It could be an endpoint to an API. But in this case, we are linking to a local file in the data folder. What type is it? Is it XML or JSON or whatever? And then what does it do once it successfully loads whatever file you were trying to get? So in this case, on success, save it as XML, as the variable, an object called XML, log that we made it, and then I'm writing a function that passes XML to a new function because I don't like my document ready and this AJAX request to just keep spreading out. So we're going to go ahead and create a new function called parse data. We want to receive XML, the object XML from it. And here we can console.log XML. Okay. So I'm going to show you what this does. So we're going to save it, and we're going to go here and make sure we're on the right file. And when we load it, you will see that it loads success. So all it did was go to the document already, run the AJAX call, and get success. And now on success, we're going to send it to the parse data XML, saving it, refreshing it, and I mistyped that, sorry. And then you'll see that it logs the XML in a nice, easy to manage node system. So I can open and close these nodes and kind of drill down into to look at this. So let's look at our XML. This XML has a node called people, and inside there is a person, and person has an attribute called name and another attribute called image URL. And then it has a child node called description, which is exactly what I see logged here. So I am getting the data successfully. So my AJAX request was taken successfully and the data was then passed, and now we can use it. Now, whenever you see a document that has a lot of nodes in it, it's likely that you're going to use a loop to process through and understand what's in that file. So you're going to basically say, open this file, see all the nodes, select all those nodes for as many times as there are nodes. So we're going to do a loop. So we're going to use a for each loop, but jQuery does a unique way of doing this. And so we're going to do that here. Now, I am going to copy and paste it so I don't mistype it this time. But we have a basic function that we're going to call that says jQuery, select all the XML that we just did, find every person, so any node that has a person, and for each one of them, I want you to go do some code. So in this case, we have a function, and inside that function is a loop. This is a loop. The .each is a loop. It's a little bit different than a vanilla JavaScript loop in the syntax, but it does the exact same thing, and it does it for everything that's in the XML. So this should run 3 times, and so let's just make sure that is the case. So it's working. Now, what we need to do is to actually understand the data that we have. So we have this object called XML, and for every person we can now start writing the HTML. So we can do var person, and so this in scope is only available inside the parse data function. But the var person is going to go to jQuery this. And what that means is this node that we have gone through and selected, so whatever was just selected by jQuery, save it as person. So now if we log person, we get the full node and all of its metadata, the length and all this, okay? And so it's not that helpful to log it, but yes, it's great to know that there's attributes here. I can get those attributes, I can get all this information, and it's all there, okay? So we have now saved an object called person. Okay, so that was step one. Now let's just say we want to extract out the name out of this object person. We can do var name equals person, the variable we just created, dot attribute, attr, and then name, the name that we get that. So as I look at this XML, I see a person with an attribute that has name, and I want to get the value of that attribute. So it was called name, and so here now instead of logging person, I'm going to log name. So we should see 3 names here. 1, 2, 3. We have 3 names because that came from selecting this in our data. So this is how you select an attribute. But in our data, we also have a description. So this description is not an attribute, but it is a child node, and we want to select the child node. And so we need to see if we can find the description. So what we're going to do is var description equals person dot find, similar to what we did just above. The name that we want to find is description. And then we want to get just the text because there's all these other attributes and metadata that comes with it when we select a particular node, just like we did up here. But in this case, we only want the text. So we're going to do that. And now if I log description, we see the text of each one of these descriptions. So let me show you what happens if you don't put text on here. So this is a nice function that's really helpful. But in our case, it gives you the object. And so we want the text of the object. So we're going to leave that as text. All right. So now you know how to select an attribute and you know how to select a child node. What I want you to do now is to select the image URL. Now, in JavaScript, we use camel casing, but I like to keep my variable names the same as what they came from the data. So I'm going to break that rule and do it exactly like it was in the data. Okay, it doesn't matter, but that's the way it's written in the data, so that's what I'm going to do in my JavaScript. Okay, totally your choice. So now I want you to do this. Remember, this is an attribute, not a node. So how would you select this? Okay, hopefully you typed person.attr and then image URL because that's exactly what is right here. And let's test it. And we have our image URL. So now we have basically selected out all of these different items for from this one node, and we do it through the loop, so it happens every time. So we've selected them. Now we want to write our HTML, and this is the same thing we've done in previous loops of JavaScript, where we have a var HTML, and then we want to put some HTML in here. So I'm going to do a couple of different tags for you because I think this is something that we don't see often. So why don't we do a DT data table. And now we're going to do, oops, I've got to put it in quotes. Note that I'm using single quotes because we're going to be doing a lot of kind of HTML writing here. So I'm doing some single quotes. The reason I'm putting these on multiple lines is because we're going to add some stuff to this. So we can just keep concatenating this. And so now let's do some HTML and create a P class equals name. And now we put in name plus close the P class. Oops. All right, so let's see if that works. So we have it there, but we'll need to actually write this to the page, and we can write this for every time that there is every time we have a new node. We'll do this inside our loop. jQuery select DL data list dot append. And what are we going to append? We're going to append $HTML. Now, I didn't actually do the data list yet. So inside my function, but outside of my outside my loop, inside the function, outside the loop, I need to also write a little bit of HTML to make this work, because I forgot to do it before. Sorry about that. So jQuery, select the body of the document and append to the body. Remember, we've done several different commands for this. And we're going to do, we'll just do h1. And then we need to basically do the same thing again and add that DL. So now let me refresh this page, and you'll see we wrote our HTML, and then here we have our 3 names that went through the loop. So this is working, and they're receiving the CSS that was already previously written. All right, so now back to where we were. We have a loop that stores information. We get that the loop selects attributes and it selects nodes and writes it to the HTML. So we did a name, and now we just need to do a little bit more HTML work to do the description. And to save time, I'm going to paste it in, but it's concatenating again. And we need to close the DD. So the DD opens, the DD closes, and we can go right there. Now we have a name and we have a description, and so we'll ultimately need to put in the URL. So what I want you to do now is, I'll give you a hint. Up here, I want you to put in an image tag for putting in an image. Put it right here in this HTML, this DT. I want you to put an image tag for the dynamic image URL. Hopefully you did this. We have an image class, and I'm going to use bioimage. You didn't know this, but bioimage was a class that was built into into the CSS. It has an alt tag and a source tag, and then I concatenate it with image URL, the variable name that was called up here. And then I need to make sure my quotes are correct. So I want to do a single quote and then end in a single quote here. And now I have an image URL. I'm going to save that, refresh it, and look at there. We now have a nice page created by XML. So that's what I just asked you to do. I should have had the slide up. All right, so we have our variables, we have our HTML written, and it is writing to the page. You're going to need to practice this to understand it. What I want you to do is to walk through and look at this code and see if you actually understand what's happening. So let me show you real quick. I'm going to walk through and explain. Starting at line 1, whatever has been starting at line 1, select the entire document, and if it's ready, go ahead and run the AJAX function from jQuery. So jQuery, run AJAX function, and pass this information to it. It needs to be a GET request. Here's the URL. We're going to do XML type, and we're going to save that XML as an object, and you're going to call a function called parse data when that is successful. The parse data function receives the XML, and in this case, it logged it. Then it wrote a little bit of HTML to the page, and then came the loop. So that loop said find every person in the XML data, and for each time you find a person, save the person, save the node, then save out the name, save the description, save the image URL, and log one of those. Now that we've saved these things, take this HTML variable and start writing some HTML, concatenate that with the image URL, add some tags, and then concatenate that with name, add some more tags, the description, close it, and then write all of that to the DL tag. So now when I refresh this, you should see everything looking nice. Okay. So what I want you to do now is to do the same thing, but what I've given you is a different data set. So we were using my data. I want you to use Tar Heel data. And I want you to create a very similar page that looks and feels just like this, but uses different data. So you need to create a page that has these top Tar Heels, and it should have all of these people. Again, it's 3 people. And note that there are some attributes and there are some nodes, some child nodes. Note that the way we did an image in this one will have to be different than the way we did an image previously, because this case the data is a node and not an attribute. So you need to display the name, the description, and the image of the data that is here.